Why is melee bad?
In PoE 1?
Just in general in action RPGs, it always seems to be, regardless of its state even, the butt of the joke in some capacity, right? Why is that?
I guess it's inherently harder to create good melee than it is to create good ranged. You don't have to worry so much about animation with ranged attacks and so on. Like, there's just a lot. It's just a lot easier to do. With melee, it's like, okay, not only do you have like a bunch of animation challenges, you've got a bunch of control challenges, you've got like a whole, like, it's just a lot. It's a lot of things. And then even when you come to balance, there's a lot of concerns, like, there's the expectation of if you're close to a monster that you should therefore have more defenses, which is like in some cases reasonable, in other cases not. There's like a whole lot of challenges around monster AI. It's kind of like it's just a much harder thing to do. Like if we made a ranged only game, we would be having a much easier time than having to worry about all this melee stuff. It wouldn't be unreasonable to say that it's part of why we even started the project, because like it really was down to changing the rigs of the player characters, and the reason we wanted to change the rigs is because the animators were not happy with the rigs in PoE 1. They weren't able to make animations for it. Like, in order to fix melee, we had to restart the character stuff from scratch, and that's what led into all of the things that went down the road and then to making a sequel. So the answer to how to fix melee was make a new game, apparently.
Make Path of Exile 2. Yeah. You're taking a decent crack at it in PoE 1 right now, but...
For sure, but the thing is, like, we're still limited in what we can do. Like, we can make a lot of balance changes, and that will help, and that's needed.
Yep.
But it isn't the same as what you need to do to really make like a proper action game. Like PoE 1 isn't going to get to the point where like the melee combat feels satisfying in the same way that a single player action game would. It's just simply because we don't have the the ability to do all the animation stuff we need to do.
This was the opening salvo of a great interview I got to have with Jonathan and Mark, lead producers and designers on Path of Exile 2, during my recent visit to their studio. I really wanted to try and dig a little deeper on their efforts to try and make the best possible action RPG by critiquing it from the perspective of melee. Precisely because it's so hard to do right. Most stat-heavy RPGs simply don't. If you start describing deep, satisfying melee combat, then people will assume you're talking about an action game, like a Souls-like or a fighting game, even. It's generally safer to abstract the melee combat experience in games like Path of Exile to stats and dice rolls, especially in online ones. That's just because if there are really any flaws in the action of the combat in the game, well, melee will hold up a magnifying glass to it. So because of that, I played exclusively melee on my trip, and we spent a good half an hour deep diving into it during our chat. And I think they're getting close here. I felt a hair's breadth away from something pretty special, particularly as I got a few hours deep into my Monk gameplay, where I started to feel like I was getting really close to realizing a combat experience that I've never had in a game like this before. So let's find out how they're trying to finally make melee not the butt of the joke in action RPGs.
I mean, the main thing really is, you have to look at action games and look at what they're doing. If you look at what really good action games do, it's not just like you make a single animation for attack and call it done. You have to have all sorts of variations depending on character state. You have to have like things about, for closing and so on. You have to make sure that you've got control as much as possible throughout the course of a melee attack, which is something that... then once again comes down to even more animations and things to do, there's lots of things like that. It's a lot of small details, but ultimately what you need to focus on is those sort of action game stuff. And I think there aren't that many kind of like online games that really do that, not that we're an MMO exactly, but in that kind of like online game genre that have really done a lot of that. There are some, right? Especially in Korea. There's been a lot of attempts at doing that kind of action game that's online thing. It's just something I think that is inherently hard.
Yeah, I guess it's something to do with like the physicality of an action RPG is much more important. You're not just tab targeting and then just saying you can make melee good through the stats, through the numbers.
For sure, yeah.
You can't. It's not just the numbers here.
For sure, no. And honestly, numbers are important, but yeah, they're not the most important thing for this. It's a different ballgame entirely.
So you mentioned like changing the animations, animation cancelling, be able to dodge roll, things like that.
Absolutely, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
That you need both big combos and those skills that link together, but you also need something that you can maybe just cast for free or spam or some sort of staple melee attack. Do you feel like you're kind of building that design area out there?
So it's sort of interesting actually, because one of the things in that we've done recently in PoE2, which wasn't in the build, I believe, that you have, is that basic melee is actually now, basic default attack is now a supportable skill on your character. So effectively, you can add support gems to it. It actually, technically speaking, it levels behind the scenes. You don't have to actually like gain experience for it or anything like that, but like technically it levels up in the way, so it's got the same scaling factor as all the other skills do, and that means that default attack actually becomes like part of your build, and of course it's a free action, and all the mana costs that would be any mana multipliers that would be on support gems obviously multiply with 0, so you can use them for free on default attack, and that actually becomes part of the kind of like the staple, and that's actually an interesting one that was a little controversial because it actually, I find that it helps a lot because you do need that kind of like to make the big attacks land more interestingly, you need to have like other sort of moments of just like a basic default kind of attack, and we tried to do that initially with something like in PoE1 Heavy Strike was effectively supposed to be the like default attack replacement, as it were, and in the end it was kind of like, okay, what is Heavy Strike really doing that default attack isn't doing if default attack leveled up and if the animation was good and if like all that sort of stuff, you know what I mean? Like there was no real distinction there. So effectively the way that PoE2 looks at it is that all weapons have a built-in skill effectively that's free, and you can support that skill. And so that's true for caster weapons as well, where they've got like the built-in fireball or whatever it is. You can support those as well. And that is a sort of the way that the way it works in PoE2 now.
Yeah, I noticed the two-hand default attack was separate to the one hand, and I could use that to weapon swap.
That's correct. Yeah, so effectively that's the way we look. Since we look at it that way now, it's like each weapon has its skill that like that default attack is part of that weapon, and so that means that you can exactly as you said, you can swap like that.
It is important in that regard, though. It's like one problem we're having, or challenge we're having to overcome, though, is now that the default attack does get supports and level up, if it happens to be one of the better choices, then you actually feel like using skills is no longer worthwhile. That is a challenge we've had to kind of work around and make sure, and I would say there's still more work to do there, because what we often found is that people were playing this and then over time they might have learned, because we didn't have correct balance on number of our skills or whatever, that they're like, wait, why am I even using this skill? I'm just going to default attack all the time, and that can make the game feel quite flat and boring. So there is a fine line to tread there, and we're certainly getting there, but like it's difficult. It's
actually interesting because it highlighted issues with bosses where, default attack, so in general, right, the more targets something hits, the less damage it should do, because the idea is that you're using that, for larger areas and so on. So default attack being pure single target, therefore has actually a relatively high damage compared to the sort of flashier big AoE skills.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that then is that when it comes to boss design, you have to make sure that, as Mark was saying, that you can't just default attack at that being the strongest thing. Yeah. And the way that needs to happen is you need to make sure that both that it relies even more heavily on making sure that there's interesting comboing stuff that you can do to make it so that you want to weave in all sorts of other stuff around that. But also it means that boss AI becomes even more important. And then there's also other challenges that things like FLASKS. So what we found when we made that melee default attack change was suddenly FLASKS were too good, because it was too easy to just sit there, face tank the boss and just flask through it. Like if you had 5 health flasks, you could, that became actually the best way to kill a boss, which is ridiculous, of course. So then you suddenly get into it's a whole thing. And this is a really challenging problem, and it's actually really hard to get around it. But how do you make, especially when it comes to new players, because for a new player, you need flasks to be good enough that they can kind of deal with whatever they need to be dealing with. But at the same time, if you make them weak such that you can't just sit there default attacking and using flasks if you put 5 of them on the bar, then they become also so weak that it becomes hard for new players to be able to deal with things. So this has been a real challenge and something that we've had to fiddle around a lot with. We found after this change we had to start making the default attacks of bosses also much higher, so that it punishes you just standing there for too long if you're not blocking and doing other things. So there's a bunch of those changes as well.
The other change that did also come alongside that, which it's crazy how you can follow go down the rabbit hole with these things, is we have just officially decided you are not portaling out of boss fights anymore. So no more going to town and coming back, because again, it is just run 5 life flasks, default attack. The moment you're down to a couple, you portal out, portal back in, back to full life resource.
So we have to avoid that stuff for sure. There was also things like, for example, we were finding that melee classes now didn't have enough life. So then we're like, okay, we need to find a way to solve that problem. We don't have life on the passive tree anymore. We've now made it so that the life you get from strength is way higher. Then we started like, okay, we need to make the mana higher from intelligence. Like this, it's just started just like rippled out into this like massive giant balanced storm of things that was crazy. And I remember Mark sent me a list of like the list of systems that were fully rebalanced in like a week in result of all of this stuff. And it was like freaking 12 things long, and they're like major things. I don't even remember like half this.
Yeah. So then the question is, how do you make a melee good? And then it's like, well, we changed 50 systems, and you don't really connect them implicitly, but they all do connect. Let alone the fact that the bosses and the monsters themselves take a very intricate amount of work to make sure that they are good against both ranged and close range archetypes. I certainly always try to make sure that close range is the preferable spot to stand, even if you are a ranged character. Generally, and I find that to be the case anyway, generally because like the moment something is say tracking, so if it goes to swing and it will track for a certain amount of time and then unleash, you have to obviously run less of a distance the closer you are. So
geometry.
It's easy to get behind them. You can see better. You can see the telegraphing. Like if you have the boss kind of half off screen, you're not going to see it, right? So just from a purely visibility sake, being in close range is preferable. But something that we're definitely doing a lot more is like fight the boss several times, being completely in point blank, and then fight the boss several times at ranged, and then adapt the AI in both cases and just get it to feel perfectly right against both. It is okay for it to be slightly asymmetric, where sometimes you want to change what you're doing, and that is done by design. But it's certainly a lot more involved now than, and mostly from lessons learned over time, but a lot of the early Path of Exile 1 stuff would never have gone through this level of rigorous iteration.
I feel like you've got at least 5 major scenarios you need to be worrying about. You've got the sort of the close range, the far away, the sort of minion case, the party case, and there has to be. Was that 5?
Yep.
I don't know.
The minion case was huge. Now it is again the case. Generally in PoE 1 we do a pass on the balance of damage against minions, but like here we're doing like how does this fight feel against minions? What are they targeting? And then in party player you don't want like a boss to be target switching too often and stuff like that. So it's kind of a lot. Like the AI pass on bosses is a lot more involved than it used to be. And we're considering as many of the archetypes as possible when doing it. And it makes things take longer, but it feels so much better.
And the kind of crazy thing about that is that like even now when we've played through Act 1 so many times, every time we play through it there's still a bunch of notes about like more AI changes to make to the bosses. It's actually outrageous the amount of like things you need to do to get it to actually be right through that whole thing. It's crazy.
I imagine you have to consider carefully like how much a boss pushes a melee character out of melee and for how long.
I'm actually a proponent of more pushing. A lot of the I think that it makes attacks, especially now. So actually, this was something that happened as a result of blocking, and I think maybe even in the build that you were playing just now, we hadn't done as much of the stuff yet, because when you block an attack, if there wasn't a push on that attack and it's a melee attack, it feels really underwhelming. So we've had to add a lot more pushes on boss melees and things like that in order to make it so that blocking it actually feels satisfying and so on. And it doesn't feel like when you've got a hit reaction from the player, that was enough to make it feel fine. But once you add the blocking in and you've got that, it's like suddenly a hit that you've just blocked and you've gotten a hit reaction on isn't good enough anymore. So like that immediately also changes another thing. And it's like, oh, I tell Mark, hey, we need to do another pass through all the bosses melees again. To go and do all of set all this stuff up now. And it's like,
we've got this massive checklist of how to set up a boss, and like it started with 300 different points, and honestly it's up to like 500 now. And every time you add a thing to it, you got to go back through every single one, do it all again, and so it's just a lot and a lot and a lot of iteration until everything just feels absolutely flawless.
I think big thing, and this relates to bosses for melee, is how well can you punish that moment when you create that moment. So whether that's either you've got the new stun and stagger system, heavy stun, super important for melee, I think, especially. So obviously melee is better for that sort of thing as well. Like it has more stun build up.
Yeah.
And then like how do you punish that? Like does Melee have the tools to punish that? Is something you've thought about a lot?
For sure. So I mean, that just comes down to all the various combos that you can do. So we have to make sure that obviously we want to make sure that every class has some level of combo gameplay going on, but for Melee it is ultra important that you've got big attacks that you can do, like big combinations of things. So like we're thinking about that when we're doing skill design. There are more skills, like coming for Warrior, even for doing that stuff. It's like you need to make sure that there's like several multiplicative factors that you can do, but only if the boss is not actively attacking you, so that you can kind of get so that you can prepare all that stuff and then get it off, so you kind of get that moment of like, yeah, that heavy stun really was meaningful. I want to get that because it's going to be the thing that's going to allow me to do the huge amounts of damage that that I can then like turn the boss fight around. So it's ultra important.
Melee do inherently stun more, as you said, and on the passive tree, of course, you can invest into it. And then physical damage also has an advantage over elemental damage.
But also bigger hits do more stun relative to smaller hits as well.
Yep. So you certainly do control, and of course melee weapons do have higher damage than ranged weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, melee has certainly all the damage advantage, and it's then just, are you good enough to maintain the uptime, or have you spec defensively enough that you can, get as much DPS uptime as you can. And honestly, like, we've done internal tests with our whole team, and at the end of it, it's very much you have a lot of normally you'd see things where it's a lot of range characters and stuff like that. It was fully like warrior monk warrior monk warrior warrior monk on the ladder, like we certainly have.
That's a good sign.
Yeah, all our melee characters pushing it. You could argue maybe it's gone too far in that direction, but everyone was enjoying it. Like, it certainly feels good and feels fun. So like, just internally, I would say, and just with people actually playing this, and I mean for a decent amount of time, like, everyone's having a very, very good time on Melee. So whatever we're doing is working, I'll tell you that. Feels ultra satisfying.
I think it's starting to get really close in the boss fights, in that you've got that stun and then you've got that moment to pull off that ability combo or that charge up ability that does a big hit, and that feels really satisfying. Like, I think it's getting close. Something I noticed where it might be missing, and it's still maybe something you're exploring, is against swarms of enemies, against those packs of enemies. How do you deal with the idea, like, melee characters inherently much more vulnerable to getting surrounded, especially as you've lent into this idea that Path of Exile 2 has a lot more body blocking, and where you are and where the enemies are is so much more important. So how do you make that feel good for Melee?
So there's a few things going on with this. So one of them is we have to make sure that stun is good enough that you can pretty reliably stun groups of enemies as you approach them. So we've got a few different tools for that. Like, if you're one hand, so that you've got less damage, then we need to make sure the shield is able to do that kind of thing. So you've got the shield charge and stuff like that. You can, generally speaking, kind of get a stun off as you arrive at a pack, so that you don't have the incoming damage being too high. The other thing as well is, for two-hand, is you kind of have those like slower attacks that kind of, as you arrive, they do a large amount. You can get the sort of stuns off there. So sort of the intention is that you are able to stun those like swarmier groups like that. But then it just also comes down to balance of defenses. And one of the things that, once again, wasn't in the build that you played, you did a full rebalance of the way that defenses work. I mentioned about the life change and like but armor's changing. Like, there's a lot of things like that. Like, all of these defensive systems have to change as well. There's actually quite large defensive changes, even just generally across all classes, even outside of Melee, happening, because like, there was actually a few things that I realized where one thing that's really important to me, once again for good combat, is you need clarity on anything that's going to matter for your defenses. You need clarity from the monster about what that is. So the most obvious example of this is that we're making sure we're not like going too wild with different colors. Like, we have to make sure the colors and damage types are really associated really well. So previously we would have done like, oh, this like thing has like fire that looks like a different color because it's like a theme. No, like, we actually don't want to do that. We want to make sure that fire is the color that it is, and if you see that color, it's fire damage, and therefore that your resistances, whether or not your resistance is going to apply to that. But there was one actually that I thought was kind of bad in this regard, which is spells versus attacks. It's very unclear on an incoming sense whether something is a spell or attack. You can kind of tell, like, maybe, but like I don't think it was clear enough, and so we actually decided to remove the distinction between spells and attacks from monsters attacking you, which means that like any defensive option that would distinguish this no longer does anymore, and that's something that I think is an improvement overall, and just makes things have more clarity there.
So that implies things like evasion.
Yep.
Previously
So evasion.
that have worked
Evasion works. As I said, there's no distinction anymore between a spell and attack on a monster. So therefore, evasion works against them. Instead, what we have is things like evasion. If you have an attack from the ground or the sky, then evasion can't evade that. So like if a slam is not evadable, but anything that isn't like that comes from the front or from like it can be. So that's like an example of a kind of thing where like it makes it much like. There are still rules to know, but it is like much more immediately visible whether or not something is going to be available and so on. And like it's the same goes with block, where like now generally the rule is trying to be if it looks blockable, it is, and that means once again it's similar rules to evasion, right? If it comes from the front, like rather than below or above you, then it's blockable, and as long as you're facing that direction, you can block it. So that kind of stuff is is pretty important.
The active blocking is certainly a big change and very powerful feeling, especially in boss fights. How do you want it to feel in boss fights versus against swarms of enemies? Yeah,
so the trouble is, of course, with blocking is that if you've got a swarm of enemies, then blocking isn't really helping you because you don't have an opening to take advantage of the block. Now, there are skills, like retaliation skills later on that sort of do aid with that. But generally speaking, it's going to be the big enemies where blocking matters, and I think it should be that way. Like, I don't necessarily want you to feel like you're just blocking all the time. The thing that I will say, though, is that it is the intention in PoE 2 that a lot more white monsters rise to the like level of being a thing that have big attacks that you'd want to block. Like there's like we've got much more monsters that are like big and you want to not so much at the beginning of Act 1, but especially as you go through, we've got like like here's a giant elephant that's like a white monster, and like you're going to want to probably block that thing, and because it's going to do a huge amount of damage to you, you know what I mean? So that kind of stuff, like even in Act 1 you've got things like there's those vampires that do these big like spear storms at you, and it's like that is a thing you're going to want to block because they don't use it very often. It does a huge amount of damage. We have to make sure that there are big damaging but not incoming hits with big telegraphs that happen even on white monsters, and if we do that, then blocking is something that you're going to want to be doing in every area, even aside from the boss fights, just for certain things.
Yeah, if those are things that aren't being like spammed at you, but they're the sort of thing you come across occasionally that's still dangerous from regular monsters, and that could work well to change up that gameplay a lot, right? So
with something like those vampires, it's like they're in packs of one with a bunch of like minions and things like that. Nice. You're not gonna. I mean, unless two packs happen to overlap and you happen to get two at once, it's very unlikely that you'd need to be dealing with that kind of stuff multiple times. And even when that does happen, we do have a system of global cooldowns where when a monster uses a skill, it puts all other monsters of the same type on that same skill on the same cooldown, and that can mean that you don't have to deal with the same thing multiple times, even across different monsters.
So pack and monster design is key for melee 100%. Gameplay feel as well. Then.
And I think that this is also something where PoE 2 is way better than PoE 1 with the monsters, is that the variety of interest you get from all the monsters all through the game, like from the very beginning to the end, is much better. And I think it's going to be really interesting when we get to maps, the variety you're going to see when you start mix and matching all those monster packs, all those different abilities across like once they're randomly in the areas as well.
Something I noticed in especially in pack gameplay is that you have a lot of these skills that are designed to be tools for specific situations. So whether it's to armor break something or if it's to punish a big stun, and these situations aren't coming up as much when you're dealing with large swarms of enemies. So I sometimes felt at a loss at what I was kind of supposed to be doing in that situation.
I guess that's just a matter of making sure we're getting the balance correct. Like if you're talking about things like what's it called, the stun
Bone Shatter.
If you're talking about things like Bone Shatter, like basically the idea would be to try and get monsters into that range. Like there are skills and tools that we have that that ideally you'd be using to be able to get things into the range to be able to do the stun. But I mean that's a matter of build design. I do think that it's good because of the way the skill system works now. It's okay to have skills you don't use very often. This was definitely not the case in PoE 1, where you didn't want to have any sort of dead skills on your character really that you weren't using constantly. In PoE 2 you can definitely have I'm using these 4 skills most of the time, but then I've got these other things occasionally for certain cases, and that's fine because you've got 9 skill slots plus extra skills you're getting from from weapons and weapon swap and so on. So that's sort of okay and intended, and it just allows for just a bit more variety and having things that just come up occasionally and then you use them.
Yeah, that gives you more tools to play with as a melee character
for different situations.
There are, of course, also melee characters not like the monk, for example, still melee, very much not relying on stun, but more on freeze. You very comfortably often get the thing where you can freeze a whole pack and then just do something real epic and shatter all of them. Same applies to even the sorceress. I know, not melee, but Ice Nova's still very close proximity. You still get the same awesome satisfaction out of that as well. Some classes can do it slightly better than others, but yeah, I think ultimately that does certainly come down to balance. And just one note from me on the monster front, like we are taking very special care to make sure every area we're asking the question, what are the blockable monsters in this area? What are the big monsters you're actually thinking about and engaging? And this becomes more prevalent as you get further into the game. And like it's made and combined with the fact we have so many monsters of every variety possible, I don't think any area feels the same as any other area. Which is real awesome. But yeah, we are very much now, again, we did all like several acts of monsters before we even introduced the active block mechanic. So now we go back through everything again and go, all right, well, we have to make melee feel good. So we will change the monsters in half the areas, we'll adapt this and change this, add skills here, and like all of a sudden, because we add one mechanic, we have to add like 60 monster skills, and
I think that's why I wanted to explore deep diving melee here with you, is because it holds such a lens up to everything you're doing design-wise. It really puts a fine-tooth comb over everything you're doing here. The default attacking, is that something that you're intending to be used pretty consistently long term, or is it more of like an early game situation as a gap filler?
It is something that you'll be using, I think, through the game. I wouldn't want you to think that it's like, 2/3 of your attacks are going to be default attacks or something like that, but it is something that does make sense to be using, I think. And as I said, like because it's supportable, because we've got a lot of interesting support gems that you can do with it. Like it can serve as your, for example, like if you're not otherwise doing freeze, it could serve as your freezer if you're using the right supports with it. It could serve as like a way to bleed enemies. It could serve as a way to blind enemies. It could serve, like there's all sorts of things you could do to kind of like use it as a way to sort of do something else in addition to just doing some damage.
Yeah, so when people hear default attack right now, they think like the boring thing that occurs when I can't do other stuff that I don't want to do. But it sounds like you're trying to make more of a blank slate skill here, a build your own skill almost.
For sure.
So how much room are you giving to playing with like how it physically functions then? How it feels to use that actual skill? I mean,
ultimately it is like a basic hit animation, but I think that there is perfectly room to do that. And like in PoE 1, just a basic hit I don't think felt good enough to really sort of understand that. But in PoE 2, that feeling of just hitting a monster is a lot better. Even in the, if you're talking about something like the staff attack, like you've got the step attack in there, so you're like moving towards the monster as you do it. There's all that sort of stuff going on with it as well. So just overall, I mean, like I feel this is actually another one as well. Is like if you you need to be able to make just a basic attack feel good, or what are you even doing, if you know what I mean?
If you can't get that right.
If you can't get that right, then what are you getting right? You know what I mean? It's like, so that to me, I feel like I just enjoy even just the experience of just hitting monsters on that level.
I'm a big fan of that design approach of making a game feel good at the most fundamental level of pushing a button and thing happen.
Right.
Yep.
For sure.
If you out of mana and you go to use a skill, is default attack then something that it's going to automatically use? Because I noticed that wasn't a thing.
I think
in my testing
that earlier. We turned that off, and that was because once again default attack is more of a skill now in that sense. So I think that we don't currently do that. We have a more clear out of mana indicator now.
It is. But it still creates that interruption in your gameplay. I think that's not very fun.
It does, but I actually when default attack replacement was happening, I had that feeling of losing control of my character, which I didn't like of it not doing the thing I expected, which obviously you're going to get if you run out of mana, but it felt like worse to have a thing that that, because then it's like that, now to interrupt that you'd have to do a dodge roll or something. Like there's it felt like losing control, and I didn't like that. It felt a lot better to me to just make sure that we didn't do that anymore. So that behavior, I think, was something that needed to be removed.
Is that too fundamental to what you're designing there to be an option that you can toggle?
I mean, I suppose we could do that. There's nothing really, but to me, it just feels worse.
I wonder if it's a preference thing or not.
We're certainly at the point where it's, as we're talking about, get the fundamentals right. And it's very easy to cop out of getting things right and then to add options. And so we're making sure we take back all the options, get it right, and then we'll reevaluate what's needed then. Otherwise, again, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with I wanted to do X and my character now is doing Y. I didn't want it to do that. So I certainly prefer fully that it's just tell me I'm out of mana, don't pathfind me up there, don't attack on the spot. I don't want to do that. I wanted to seize this opportunity to do this skill. Yes, I failed to make sure I had enough mana, and so I will give me the fail indicator and let me reevaluate what I want to do, instead of making me do something that I didn't decide to do. I think it's very important, very, very important you don't ever, if you input something, you don't do something that you didn't input. That might not have mattered so much with the high frequency of PoE 1 because you can get through that attack then very quickly and then recalibrate, but time matters and decisions matter when you've got single life combat, single life boss of things going on, and you want to dodge the skill and all of a sudden you're doing something you didn't sign up for. It can have a lot more ramifications for your time, I guess, by having the wrong thing happen. So right. I'm a huge proponent of changing that. We'll see how it goes at the end of the day. I would say that's something that actually hasn't come up from other people. I think in general, people have been pretty happy with our change to that. I mean,
honestly, I don't think anyone noticed it until you
probably maybe not.
One other thing, by the way, just as a random side note, we are actually adding a miss indicator so that you can tell when you miss. It isn't like a piece of text next to the monster. It's actually just above the life bar, or on the life bar of the monster that you're highlighting, so you can see there if you're missing a target. Which
it does a swoosh or something.
It's got a little just miss piece of text that appears in the life bar. Oh, yeah. And so that way we don't have it in the playfield where it kind of is immersion breaking. It's kind of
having some sort of feedback there.
Yeah. But that is important because it's something that if you can just not realize that you're missing, and then
I didn't notice myself miss any major attack, which I noted was important given that each skill used is much more important in this game.
So for melee, you shouldn't really be missing until later on, and even then, mostly it should just be evasive monsters. Generally speaking, if you're just progressing through, you probably and you're playing melee, you're probably not missing anything unless it's a highly evasive dex monster, and then you should be able to solve that problem even by just allocating some dex. But if you're a ranger, different situation. You do need to be the dex should be solving this for you, but you need to keep up with the dex to make sure that you're doing that.
I think it makes sense too that in melee it feels like you're physically hitting the monster, so for them to just be miss, it doesn't really feel right. For sure. But for an arrow shot or something, then that's maybe a bit more reasonable.
And it does affect melee in cases where you have skills that hit from further away. Yeah. So if you've got some
pseudo-ranged.
Kind of some sort of pseudo-ranged melee stuff, then because it's based on distance, that matters for that too. So accuracy can come into play in those kind of situations.
How is mana an important part of the puzzle here for melee, and how do you make it feel good? I noticed there was a much bigger difference in the cost of skills. Some were very expensive, and whereas in Path of Exile 1, it's much more about generally, can you spend this skill or can you not? Right.
So, we want to actually make mana cost meaningful, but it is so hard to get this right. And honestly, it might be one of the things that has had the most arguments about this internally.
That was tough.
Honestly, I don't even know how to really answer this because, other than to say we want mana to be meaningful for both melee and and spellcasters. The one thing that PoE 2 does do, I don't think PoE 1 does this, is that mana costs are now paid over the duration of the use of the skill.
You can cancel the mana cost.
So that means you can cancel without mana loss, but also means that if a monster interrupts you, the cost doesn't feel quite so punitive.
Getting stunned out of an attack.
Exactly. So that kind of thing has kind of helped as well. But it means that those long attacks, they can have quite large mana costs, but they pay.
You enter a payment program, like a loan repayment system for them.
That. I mean, we generally still have your cookie cutters are much cheaper.
Yep.
Support gems have less impact on mana than they do in PoE 1.
Yes.
There are obviously ways to invest into mana and all that, but the main also thing is you don't have all of your mana reserved, right? You actually have this resource in this game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're using that full bar now.
And the costs do grow as you level them up, but I think generally melee skills gain more damage per level in PoE 2 than, say, in PoE 1.
Yep.
And of course, we kind of look at each skill and we're like, how often are you expected or really going to use this? If it is a big finisher, right, it is kind of cost higher because the expectations you're using it as a finisher, such that if you are just spamming it, you're probably not going to have a rough time. So it is a factor that you do need to consider when looking at the skills, and I'd say mostly it's going to be a little bit jarring coming from PoE 1 to 2 if people make that transition. Very, very, very different mana ecosystems, and I suspect it's more going to be people getting used to it. Like I think if a new player starting will be very, very, they'll analyze that and be okay with it. But yeah, it's more the jarring jump from one game to the other that I suspect is going to catch people up.
And it's really just the reservations, I would say, is like, because you're expected to have the resource, that just changes the thing. Like we never, PoE 1, just due to the way it evolved, didn't have that expectation. So therefore, you often have the mana, and therefore the costs of melee attacks were very cheap. And so then we couldn't differentiate, like we couldn't make a skill powerful in PoE 1 because it used a lot of mana, because that just wasn't okay. And now in PoE 2, that is a thing we can do. We can say the skill is powerful, but it used a lot of mana.
Something with melee is that you have a bunch of different archetypes or power fantasies that you can fulfill with that. Like you have, the paladin with the big shield, the knight or whatever. You have the two-handed, kind of marauder. What sort of archetypes of power fantasies are you looking to fulfill here?
I mean, we are looking to do all of the ones that you typically see in games, and we have a lot of classes. We haven't shown, honestly, like melee being some of the hardest stuff to make. Some of the other melee classes that we haven't shown, that fulfill some of those other sort of fantasies, haven't really been talked about. People know what the class names are, but like obviously, if you're thinking about the whole like big shield, like defensive thing, like the Templar is something that you imagine, could be fulfilling that. So, and then of course we've got the duelist and so on. There's things, there's other stuff going on with that.
Of course, we haven't even gotten into the ascendancy classes, right? Like those allow you to fulfill even more.
That's where you can focus in the idea of like a skilled duelist into a gladiator or something else.
So there's still more of those melee archetypes to come. We've kind of got the slam stuff, and we've got the kind of the fast moving staff monk thing going on. There's the two that we're kind of showing, that we've showed so far. But we want to have like all those different archetypes, by the time we're releasing.
So I walked away from my exploration of Path of Exile 2's melee pretty excited and keen for more time with it. I was on a highly experimental and thus quite unstable internal build, and we had a few issues, so I couldn't really sink as many hours in as I wanted to, but I got to at least see a little deeper into what they're trying to achieve, and the most recent vision of that. I was particularly taken with the weapon automatic switching, which I tried to play around with as much as I could, even before kind of technically unlocking the extra support for it in the game where you get a second passive tree and the ability to manually set skills. You can still use it before that point even. And the new build options that opened was really interesting. I got to mess, for example, with a big two-hander to punish bosses, and then swapping to a shield automatically by pressing my active block skill when I needed it. And on the monk, I even messed around with using a spellcasting staff to build freezes up with an Ice Nova gem that I carved before auto-swapping to the quarterstaff when I wanted to melee to finish off those frozen mobs. The monk in particular started to feel really fascinating to me the deeper I went with it, with so many options for how you actually like engage a pack and how you could combo abilities together. Like surface level, there's explicit combinations like building frenzies with a palm strike and then dropping them into a massive lightning strike for very big, satisfying, flashy gameplay moments. But it went a lot deeper when I started to explore how I could use all of the different tools to manage different kind of packs and different kind of encounters. It didn't ever feel like I was just doing a kind of set skill rotation. I think you will develop a few of those sorts of things, but it felt like I was using a lot more things contextually based on what was actually going on in the gameplay. That personally allays one of my fears about kind of combo-oriented gameplay, that it will devolve into just pressing the same buttons in sequence, for example. I felt like there was a lot more potential for it to be much more dynamic instead. I feel like in Path of Exile 1, I do 90% of my theory crafting and path of building. And I don't think that's going away with Path of Exile 2, nor would I really want it to. I love that aspect of the game, but I do feel that I'm going to be spending a greater percentage of my theory crafting time in Path of Exile actually in-game, testing and experimenting with the physical act of playing my character. I'll have to figure out with each new build kind of how I handle the moment-to-moment gameplay and when I use certain skills, and that will be a far larger part of the build creation than it's been in the past. It's not unusual to see a build video for a Path of Exile 1 build that doesn't really even have a section about how you physically play the build. That's not that rare, but I think that section of the video will be much more important, and at least always be there in Path of Exile 2 build guides. And I'm very excited for that strange new world. I suspect there's also the potential that builds will become a bit more personal in PoE 2 as well, because each person will probably handle how they use those different skills a bit more differently than they do in Path of Exile 1. What really defines Path of Exile 2's melee experience right now for me is the combo of having a vast arsenal of skills that you get to figure out when and how to use, and a lot more actual movement in your gameplay. You actively avoid enemy attacks, reposition, and move while you're attacking, most importantly. Going beyond, way beyond, just basic stutter stepping. I've always felt like melee should be like the most dynamic and interesting gameplay in action RPGs, but typically it's the least, it's the most static quite often, centered around kind of standing still and channeling or using a skill and face tanking typically. Path of Exile 2 is much closer to what I imagined as an ideal for this genre. It's a very dynamic experience that's pretty damn challenging, to be honest, but also hands you a lot more control over actually what's happening in the game. I don't doubt that one skill blasting builds that just face tank and stand there are going to exist. Like I will think they'll still be there and they'll still be popular, but there's going to be a lot more options for us to actually make gameplay more interesting if we want to, and plenty of reward for making use of those options, I think. That's exciting for any playstyle, but for melee in particular, I think it's the biggest change. It was great to critique the game through that lens, and honestly, I felt plenty of points of friction when I did so. There's still plenty of kinks for them to work out, but at the same time, I got a far more intimate look at what they're doing right now and how far they're pushing Path of Exile 2 beyond what Path of Exile 1 has done. I don't think they're just playing it safe here. That's it for the moment, but I've got a lot more of our chats with the devs to come out in the near future, talking about campaign design and some other really interesting changes to the core gameplay, so keep an eye out for those videos popping up in your sub feed. That's it for now, I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.